Okay, so let's go through a calibration of an Eclipse. Okay, before calibrating your machine, you need to check to make sure that the gantry arm is square with the rails on the machine. To do that, you use a machinist square. Take the machinist square, place it against the clamp, and move the arm over. The machine has to be off to do this. Move the arm over until it touches the machinist square. Then relocate the machinist square down to the bottom, touch the clamp, and check the arm to make sure that it's touching the square. Just like that. Touching the square. Touching the square. Okay, if it's not touching the square, you're going to need some additional tools. You're going to need an 1/8 inch Allen wrench, 7/16 box end wrench, and a 7/16 socket. Again, with the machine off, you can manually move the arm over, like so. This is your drive shaft cover here. There's a drive shaft that connects the bottom belt drive to the top belt drive. And that drive shaft is located under this cover. So you've got 2 columns of bolts. You don't need to take this column out. You need to take this column of bolts, 5 bolts out. Okay, so there are nuts on the back side underneath the table, and use your wrench and take all those nuts off. Then you can take these bolts out. And once you've done that, you can take this whole drive shaft cover off, and now you can see the drive shaft underneath. Okay. The drive shaft has a coupling at each end, flexible, what we call a spider, and 2 coupling halves. There's one at this end of the drive shaft, and there's one at that end of the drive shaft. The only one you want to adjust is this one right here. And if you move it, you can see this particular one has 2 set screws. Some only have 1 set screw. You'll notice that these set screws are deeper. Okay, that's because there's a flat machined on this shaft, so you don't want to use this. You don't want to make any adjustments here. Okay? So you could take a Sharpie and draw a line on the drive shaft and the coupling to help you in lining things up. But if you loosen this set screw and you loosen this set screw, then you can turn this coupling independent of this drive shaft. This coupling will move the bottom of the arm. The drive shaft will move the top of the arm. So by loosening this coupling and twisting this shaft or this coupling or both in opposite directions, you can affect the angle of the arm. Now I don't need to do that because my unit, my machine, was square. You can even just generally eyeball the machine, and you can look at the clamp versus the edge of the machine, and you can look to see if it's even all the way up or down. All right, once you've adjusted the drive shaft, you want to put the cover back on. Okay, that's it. We've loaded the software on the machine, for some reason, maybe we needed a new computer or whatever, we go into the Eclipse Create software, and I make a 16 by 16 single mat, add an opening, and put a 1 by 1 opening in the center. Send that to cut right there. Cut software opens up. It says, do you want to initialize? Well, it's very important that you pay attention to your machine when it initializes, because it does a certain number of steps. First thing it does is it turns the motors on, and it moves the cutting head up and to the right, and then it comes back and finds the home switches. Then it turns the cutting head on, and it tips the cutting head over, and then comes back to the home switch, and then makes one last move. So we're going to initialize the machine right now. Okay. Now, the first thing we want to look at is the cutting head straight? So let's look at this a minute. Okay. So you can see that the angle between this edge right here and this edge right here, they're not parallel. This cutting foot is tipped over in this direction. We want to straighten it out. Okay? So to do that, we're going to go into Setup and Settings, and we're going to go to the Hook tab. Now, the Hook tab says, right now we've got it set at 0 for the correction amount, and because of that, it's stopped right on the home switch and it's not straight. Now we have a picture here that says, do you want to rotate the cutting head clockwise or counterclockwise? And if you want to do this, then you press this button. Okay. This says, hey, look, 56 equals 1 degree. So 56 counts on the encoder is 1 degree. I've got 28 in this correction box, which is half a degree. So every time I push this, it's going to adjust the cutting head half a degree. Now, we got to look at this over here, and we've got to guess what we need to go around, and we want to go clockwise. So I'm going to say, let's say 3 degrees. Okay. So I'm going to go click this 6 times because every one is half a degree. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, we'll click OK. Will it know we do not want to save a new profile? This is the default, unless you want to give the profile a new name. And now the machine's going to reset. Okay, I don't know if you saw that little move at the end, but you'll want to maybe replay this video to see it. Okay, now let's look and see if this is straight. It looks like it needs to go maybe half a degree more. So we'll go back into Settings, go to Hook, go 1 click more, maybe 2. Let's see. Hit no. Okay. Machine will reset. Turns over, comes up, stops, makes one little last move. Okay. Now that is pretty dang straight. So we'll start cutting with it at this. We can correct it if we need to. Okay. All right, now that we have the hook correction set, we need to check the blade depth. And you're going to need a sample piece of mat board with a bevel on it. Small piece like this. Okay, If you go into setup and blade change, it will give you some instructions. Loosen the thumb screw here, loosen the thumb screw here, flip this over, tip the cutting head open. Okay, warning, the blade will extend when the OK is clicked. Okay, so if I click OK, see how it extended the blade out? Okay, so we can repeat that process. Setup, blade change. Okay, now before I extend the head, I want to put the V-groove switch on. So I'm going to push the V-groove switch over. Okay. Now I'm going to click OK. All right. So now you'll notice that I am not touching this side of the V-groove switch, but I am touching this side of the V-groove switch. Okay. So this screw is controlling how far this blade sticks out down here. So if I take my sample mat board and I put it here, I want the tip of the blade to go 90% of the way across the mat. Just like that. 90%. Okay? If that wasn't 90%, I would either unscrew or screw in this screw until it was. I'm also on the 4-ply setting of the blade stop. Okay? So everything checks out as it should. Now, if I take the V-groove switch off, if you just want to double check yourself, you can extend the head back out. Now you can put your sample mat board up there, and you can see that the tip of the blade goes completely through and across the mat board. Okay, so it will cut through. So we're okay with that test. Now we're going to go to overcuts. By default, the exit overcut should be set at 0.15. The reverse entry should be set at 0.09. On the left turns, the forward exit 0.09. Reverse entry 0.03. This is for cutting from the back, regular bevel. Okay, so if I change to reverse bevel, you'll see the settings are different. So on this, now where right turns up here, and this is 0.15 and 0.09, and the left turn is 0.15 and 0.15 for the other setting. Okay, never mind this setting, it's just a default that says how much these plus and minus buttons will change this number. That's a 64th of an inch roughly. So, okay, you'll also notice that if I change to the front, these settings stay the same. 15, 09, 15, 15. Cutting from the front and cutting from the back, reverse bevel, are exactly the same cut. The difference is how you load the mat board in the machine. Do you load it, if you're cutting from the back, reverse bevel, you put the color down. If you're cutting from the front, you put the color up. That's the only difference. Okay, the next thing is, let's set the V-groove settings while we're in here, the default ones. They should be 0.06 positive, 0.06 positive, minus 0.02, minus 0.02, and a V-groove width of 0.08. You'll notice that a V-groove has 4 overcuts in the corner because it has a V-groove is a regular bevel cut right next to a reverse bevel cut. You cannot calibrate V-grooves until you've calibrated regular and reverse bevel. You cannot calibrate reverse bevel until you've calibrated regular bevel. Under miscellaneous, blade reaction time up should be 200, down should be 350. Oval drop time should be 0. We'll talk about how to use these settings later. This is the reset distance that when you tell the machine to initialize, that the cutting head moves up and to the right. So this is up and this is to the right. If we're cutting a whole sheet of mat boards out, we want it to go down and to the left by default, meaning we're going to start cutting up here on the sheet and we're going to work our way over and then down. I'll show you that later. This is the gap between mats. If we're cutting, let's say we're cutting 4 mats out of a sheet and we wanted to cut the frame size 2, we have to have some space between the mats. You can cut the top mats first or the bottom mats first, whatever you desire. This is an overcut adjustment for cutting pointy things like stars. This adds 80% to the overcuts, the standard overcuts, for cutting acute angles like stars out. All of these settings are the defaults that will come up when you start the cut software. Typically it's openings only, cut from the back, regular bevel, single mat. Some of you may want to cut from the front all the time, so you could change this to cut from the front. Some of you might want to cut frame size all the time, so you could change this to cut frame size. And then when you change it in here on the settings, it will always come up that way over here by default. It doesn't mean you can't change it, but by default, that's what comes up. Okay, oval hook should be set at 0. Okay, we'll talk about centering in a minute. So we'll click OK. So now we have our opening that we're going to cut. The dashed green line is non-cutting motion. Motion, we're moving from this point to this point. Then we put the blade in, and then we cut, and then we cut and cut and cut. Okay? So we're going to close the cutting head, and we're going to lock this lever. Oh, I have this too tight. I'm going to lock this lever in place, snug that nut so this doesn't move. Okay? Now we're going to press cut. Okay, now this is difficult to see, so I'm going to shade over it with my pencil. Okay, so that's the way it should look. Let's see if I can get some better lighting. Okay, so we told the machine for our first mat to cut a 1" by 1" opening in the center, 7.5 all around, of a 16 by 16 mat. So after we're done, I shaded the opening, and now I'm going to measure it to make sure that it's 1 by 1. And it looks to me like it's not 1 by 1. It's actually under by a 32nd of an inch. Okay, so to fix that, I'm going to go back to the cut software. And I'm going to go to settings, setup, settings. And here is my tool offset calculator. And the program width box, I'm going to put in 1 because that's what I told it to cut. And then in the cut width box, I'm going to put in 30 seconds because that's what it cut. When I press the enter key, it will calculate that as a decimal and jump to the calculate button. Now when I press this button, it's going to change this number to compensate. So as soon as I hit calculate, that number is now 293 instead of 250. Your machine will be different. Every machine will be unique here. Okay, so I'm going to click OK. Do I want to save a new profile? No. Okay, settings have been saved. Doesn't look any different. Now let's go to 1.5 by 1.5. Send that to cut. Now I have a bigger opening down here in proportion to my white space. And I'm going to cut that. Okay. So now I cut the second opening here. Okay, now if we check that second opening and we look, we hold 1 inch on the outer opening, and we go over there, it's 1.5 inches. Woohoo! Okay, unclamp the mat board. Let's slide the mat board over. We'll take this piece out. Oops, forgot that little piece too. And you can see maybe the cuts in the slip sheet here. Okay. That's why you got to use a slip sheet. All right, now, according to our software, our margins should be 7.25 inches. The machine is only responsible for the opening size and the left margin and the bottom margin. It does not know how big a mat board you put in. Look, I didn't even put in a 16. It's big, okay? And it doesn't know the top. It doesn't know what size piece of board you put in. So we already checked the opening size. Now we need to check from the edge of the mat over. Now, that's supposed to be 8.25 or 7.25. And if I hold 1 inch, it's supposed to be 8.25, but it's not. So I'm gonna report what it is. So it's 6 5/8 plus a 32nd. Okay, so if I go back to the cut software and I go to setup and settings and centering, now I need to tell it what I measured here. So what I say, 6 5/8, right? 6.625 plus 1/32. And now I need to tell it what the bottom is. So I go over here, and I measure the bottom, and it is 6 5/8. Okay, so I'm going to go to the centering tab and I'm going to put in 6 5/8. I could put a decimal. Oops, I typoed. Space 6 5/8. I could put a decimal, I can put a fraction, I can use math. Once I hit enter, it turns it into a decimal anyways. Now, once I hit this calculate centering button, it will change these two numbers. Okay, so those are the new numbers that it's going to use for reference for this 0 point here. So I'm going to click OK. I'm going to hit no. Okay. Now it says, hey, the machine's going to reset. Okay. So make sure your machine's clear and go ahead and reset. Let's put the mat board back in here. Let's clamp it down. And let's make a 4" by 4" because we need some margin here that's smaller than 6 5/8. So send a cut. Now we have a bigger opening in proportion to the space. Now we're going to cut it. Okay, see why we needed the 4" opening, so we wouldn't cut into this opening here. Okay, so now let's unclamp it. And let's check it. So it's supposed to be 4 inches, and it's 4 inches. Lighting is terrible. Okay. And now that's 6 inches, right? And this down here, bottom, this is why I do squares, because I only have to remember one dimension, and that's 6 inches right there. Okay, and that's what our software says, 6 inches in the Create software. Okay, so now we've got it centered. Now we can look at the overcuts. So when this mat cut, so here's our overcuts. It started cutting in this corner. This is corner number 1. It cut this direction. This is corner number 2. It cut this direction. This is corner number 3. Cut this direction. Corner number 4. And then back up to corner number 1. All right. So this overcut right here that goes this way, this is an entry overcut. And it cut along here. That makes this overcut right here an exit overcut. That makes this cut an entry overcut. That makes this cut an exit, entry, exit, entry, exit. Okay, if you're walking along this line and you come to this corner, you have to turn right to go down. So this is a right turn. Right turn. Right turns are on the mat. If I had a left turn, I would have like the state of Utah maybe. So then I would have a right turn, a left turn, and a right turn. Okay. All right. So the first thing we want to do is we want to make sure our exit overcut is right on the front of the mat. And then if it is, on the back of the mat for 4-ply mat board, that exit overcut should be about 1/8 of an inch. Now it looks a little longer than 1/8 of an inch right here, right? About a 32nd of an inch over, almost a 1/16. Okay, so that means we're going to have an overcut on the front. So let's look at the front. So when I take the mat board out and I flip it over, now what corner did we start on? We started here, and this is corner number 2. And you can see right there, you can see that there's overcuts there. And so that exit overcut that's going this way is about a 1/16 of an inch too long. All right. So when we flip it back over, that's that overcut. So we're going to make those overcuts shorter. So we're going to go into the cut software and go to setup and settings and overcuts. We're cutting from the back. We're cutting regular bevel, and we want our forward or exit overcut to be a 1/16 of an inch less. So that is 4 clicks. That's a 64th. 1, 2, 3, 4. All right, so that's going to lower, that's going to make our exit overcuts all shorter. So click OK. New profile, no. Okay. Now let's make this 4.5 by 4.5. Send that to the cut. Okay, now we have our cut window. Doesn't look too much different. Okay, so now we need to clamp our mat board in. Need to make sure it's down against this clamp and over against this clamp. And then we can clamp it. Okay, we're gonna send it to cut. We're gonna cut it. Now, if we look carefully, I guess I gotta erase some things here. You can see that there is a difference between this overcut, which is our new overcut, and that one. It's shorter, right? So it's right at about 1/8 of an inch, where before it was almost 3/32. Okay, so we did make a change. So now we take this out. It still fell out. And we look at the exit overcut. And look, this is the exit overcut right here. And we got rid of it. Or we got it down to that little shorty right there. Okay, so that's good. Now we'll go to the entry overcut. Flip this back over. Put it in and clamp it down. Now what we need to make sure of. This overcut, the exit overcut, is 1/8 of an inch. We need to make the entry overcut also 1/8 of an inch, which we have done. Okay, so we don't need to change the length of the entry overcut. Now let's look at that again. But on the front of the mat, this is our entry overcut right here. You can see we have an overcut. So how are we going to deal with that? Well, we have a couple of ways. Let's get this clamp back in. Okay. Okay, so we were talking about the entry overcut. and how to shorten it. Well, we don't need to shorten it because it's the same length. So the exit overcut's 1/8 of an inch, the entry is 1/8 of an inch. Okay, so that's what we want. But we have an overcut on the front of the mat. So to get rid of the overcut on the front of the mat, we have two choices. One of them is actually a physical adjustment that you only want to make once, if ever, and that is to slow the descent of the cutting head down to the mat board. Now the way you do that is on the side of your cutting head, there's a panel, has a hole in it. I've removed the panel so you can see inside, and there is a flow control adjustment right here. And it takes a very small screwdriver, and the rule is close it clockwise all the way until it stops. It'll get really tight. It won't ever bottom out. And then you open it counterclockwise 1.5 turns. Okay, and that is that's where this should be set, 1.5 to 2 turns. Okay, so we're gonna start with 1.5 turns, and then we're gonna do another test cut. Okay, so we're gonna go to the Create software. We're gonna make the opening 5 inches by 5 inches. We're gonna send that to cut. Cut got a little bigger. And we're gonna make sure our mat board is in and clamped. And now we're gonna cut it. Okay. So now, if we look carefully, you can see that this overcut right here, it has a little upward slope to it. And now this one is a lot straighter. They're the same length, but this one's straighter because the blade is cutting its way in rather than plunging through the mat board. Still fell out. And now we're interested in the entry overcut, which there really isn't any anymore. Oh, there's a little entry overcut right there. My camera keeps shading or putting a shadow on there, but you can see there's a little overcut right there. So we're going to turn that. We're going to turn that in just a little bit. We're going to turn it just a little bit, maybe 1/8 of a turn. And we're going to try this again. Now the other way to do this would be in settings, under miscellaneous, there is this down reaction time, which we could change. By lowering this, it will make the overcut go away. By increasing it, it will create an overcut. I like 4-ply mat board to cut at 350. So that's why, because this is an initial calibration of this machine, I'm adjusting the flow control on the side of the cutting head rather than this number. Once we're done adjusting the flow control, if we cut thicker mat board or harder mat board or softer mat board, we may want to use this setting and create a saved profile for each kind of mat board which we want to make an adjustment for. Okay, so new test cut, 5.5, 5.5, send to cut. Okay, so now we're going to cut that. Okay. Still fell out. We're looking for the entry overcut, which would be the vertical one, which we no longer have. Okay. Important part is, two, that these overcuts are very straight and clean. Entry, exit. Barely can see these over here. Exit, entry. Okay, and we want straight, clean overcuts. And then we want no overcuts on the front of the mat, like that. Okay. So now we've got cutting from the back, regular bevel, calibrated. Now we need to move on to reverse bevel. So we're going to make a 6-inch opening. We're going to send it to the cut software. And we are going to choose reverse bevel right here. Now notice the blue lines. Notice we got little overcuts showing up, and that's okay. Reverse bevel or regular bevel, we don't have any, but reverse bevel, we have some. So now we're going to test cut. So when I cut reverse bevel, when I cut regular bevel, if I use dry run, you can see it goes clockwise. If I cut reverse bevel and I use dry run, you can see it goes counterclockwise. Okay, so let's cut that. Everything's good. Cut. Now it goes down that way. Now, this is a reverse bevel. And so you can see that the piece lifts out. Okay, now the first thing we need to check is the opening size. And we told it 6 inches. So if we hold an inch, now in a reverse bevel, we are measuring down here. On a regular bevel, we measure up here. Reverse bevel down here. So if I line the one up on the inside, like so. Guess I gotta hold that more careful. And then I go over here, I'm on the 7 down at the bottom. And so that is the correct size, 6 inches. Okay. If it was not 6 inches, you would go to setup and set board thickness, and you would change this number to make the opening bigger. You would make this number bigger. To make the opening smaller, you would make this number smaller by half the error. So if this was a 32nd of an inch too wide, 64th of an inch would be 0.01. We would need to lower this number by 0.01 in order to make this opening cut correctly on the mat board. But in our case here, 0.054 is good enough. General range for 4-ply mat board is 0.05 to 0.06. It all depends on your mat foot and your machine. Okay. Now the other thing we want to look at is overcuts. So in this case, we got to flip it over, and we need to look and see if there are any overcuts on the front corner. If there are overcuts, then like this little overcut, where's my pencil? See, there is just a little bit of an overcut right there. Okay, so if we look at the back of the mat, right, there's that. It's this direction, which has got a little overcut on the front. So if we follow the way the machine cut, it went entry, and then it went exit, and then it went entry, entry, and then it went exit, and then entry, exit, entry, exit. So that's an exit overcut. Okay, so it's still a right turn because the overcut is on the mat board. So if we go over here to the setup and settings and overcuts, and we go to cutting from the back, and we go to reverse bevel, and we go to right turn, exit. We want to make that a little shorter, 2 clicks. Okay, now let's try that. 6.5 by 6.5. Send to cut. Here it is. We want to cut reverse bevel. We want to clamp the mat board down with the slip sheet under it. And then we go here and cut. Take this, and it still comes out, unclamp it, flip it over, and look and see if we have any overcuts, and we don't have any overcuts anymore. Okay, so now regular bevel and reverse bevel are calibrated. So now we can move on to V-groove. To cut a V-groove, we have to open the cutting head. So flip this lever over, put this back, put the V-groove switch on, close the cutting head, lock the lever down. Okay, now to cut a closed V-groove in the Create software, there's this little setting right here to check. Again, I want to make it bigger, so let's make it 7.5 by 7.5. Let's send this over to cut. Now notice the cut screen is blank, but there's this tab right here for V-grooves. So if I click on this, it shows me my 2 paths for the V-groove. Okay, I don't need to worry about cut from the front, cut from the back, any of that business. It's a V-groove tab. It knows what it's supposed to do. Okay, so now we're going to cut that. It gives me a warning, says, hey, you got your V-groove switch on? I'm going to say yes, because we did that, right? So now I have 2 paths around here. And there's my V groove. Drop out. I need to scrap a little blade to pick that out with. Okay. So there's my V groove. Now you want to look carefully in the corners, and you want to make sure that there's no overcuts on the outside corners, or that these overcuts go too far across. You want the corners to fall out cleanly. Okay, and you want the V groove to be the width that you want it, that you like, the style that you like. Now, if we go over here to create, or to cut, and we go to setup and settings and the V groove tab, you'll see it talks about the different V grooves. The outer bevel is dark gray, inner bevel light gray, words gray, dark gray, and white, and the width here. So if we didn't like the width of the V groove that we just cut, if we wanted it skinnier, we could make it skinnier. If we want it wider, we can make it wider. There's a limit to how wide you can make it, because the 2 cuts have to intersect at the bottom of the groove. Okay, and each one of these settings, right turn, forward overcut, means right turn, forward overcut. So if we had a little overcut showing up on our mat right here, we would want to make that shorter. If it was a right turn reverse and it was showing up here, we'd want to make it shorter, or vice, any of those adjustments. So I like the way that's turned out, so I'm not making any adjustments. So I'm just going to click OK. Now all of those settings have been saved under this profile called Eclipse Standard. I could change the name of that by going to Setup and Settings and saying Save Profile, and call it, let's say, 4-ply. Okay. And if I save that, okay. Now you see it says my current profile is 4-ply. If I wanted to retrieve a different profile, I would go to Setup, I'd go to Settings, and I'd go to Restore Profile, and then I could pick the other profile that I wanted, click OK, 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 and then all those settings would be reinstalled. They're saved in here. All right. That's how you calibrate a machine.